Hi guys, it's Renee. Welcome. This will be my first video in a series that I'm starting called Historical Highlights. Whoop, 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 whoop. Insert applause sound here. These types of videos I'm planning on making. I will be doing my makeup during them simply because I'm a new YouTuber and staring at the camera and just talking to you is a little bit awkward, and then also it's just easier for me to do it. If you guys know her, Bailey Sarian, YouTube here. I love her channel. She's great. She's hilarious. She does true crime versions of this on her channel. So she's definitely my inspiration for this, and all credit goes to her for this idea first of doing your makeup while talking about a sort of true crime story. Mine is definitely not fully true crime. It's more historical crime, but I feel like that also falls into the true crime category, which is something that I really like. Today I'm going to be talking about Rasputin, who, for those who have only seen the Anastasia animated movie, he was believed during the time to have had magic powers, but a lot of that has been disproven now. But he was a real person, and so was Anastasia, or Anastasia, depending on how you want to pronounce that. I feel like Anastasia Beverly Hills has ruined me. But yeah, we're just going to jump right into it. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about his life from the early years, even though there wasn't a lot of information from that time period. I'm going to be talking about his marriage and his children, and then I'm moving on to more of his life with the Romanovs, who were the family that Anastasia was a part of. And then I'm going to be talking about his death and kind of a little bit about what happens after that. So if you're interested in that and you want to see me just get ready with simple makeup, keep on watching. Oh my gosh, I'm so cringy. Oh no. So to start off, I know a lot of people and other makeup YouTubers, or as Jenna Marbles would put it, YouTubers, they like to link their products in the description box. However, I'm not going to do that simply because I feel like we all have our personal makeup taste, and this isn't really a makeup tutorial. This is more of a just get ready with me, and if you'd like to recreate this, I'd like to give you guys the options to do it with your favorite products and the products that work best for you, because makeup's just fun, and products that work for me might not necessarily work for you, or products that you like might not necessarily be the products that I like. So it's just easier for you guys if this ever gets views, which it probably won't. I'm going to be priming my face first. Sometimes I will use primer, other times I won't, but today I have a new primer that I want to try, so I'm going to be priming my face. I do have my handy dandy mirror down here, so if you see this pink thing or some lights and that stuff, that's just my mirror so that I can see myself up close. So Rasputin was called the Mad Monk by some, but interestingly enough, he was never a monk. Rasputin's father was actually a ferryman, and he was also a farmer, but mainly one of the articles that I was looking into talked about how he transported goods and people from one area of Siberia, which is where they were, and where Rasputin grew up and kind of lived until later in life. His father would just take people and goods and kind of ferry them in between two Siberian cities, one being a historic settlement that's about 2,500 kilometers, which is, I'm from America, so I had to look that up. It was about 1,600 miles away from Moscow. So he'd take people and goods and kind of work them back and forth. So his father married his mother, whose first name is Anna, so I can pronounce that, in 1863. They had a total of 9 kids. However, Rasputin was the first to survive. Now at the time, Rasputin was going by his full name, which is Grigori Rasputin, but I'm just going to be calling him Rasputin throughout this video because that's generally what he's known as, especially later on and then in history. So part of the reason that Rasputin and his family had had so many kids but so many died from one of the videos that I watched was because Siberia is a generally cold, harsh land. So it was really hard to survive the winters. And on top of that, they would send people that they didn't want in regular society, the Russians would, over there. So it was kind of like a place for criminals or people with different types of religions. Again, Rasputin was the 8th child, the first to survive, and he was born into a small peasant village on January... Rasputin was born into a small peasant village on January 9th of 1869. So that means his parents must have been real busy because they had 8 kids in the span of 6 years. Is that even possible? I suppose if they have twins, it's fine. Me trying to figure out old-timey people's lives So now that I've finished putting on my primer, I'm going to be tying my hair up and putting on some foundation. After Rasputin, the family also had another child who survived a bit longer, at least long enough to have children. I also can't pronounce her name, so I'll probably put it somewhere on the screen. But she and Rasputin apparently had a good relationship, according to some historians. He was made the godfather of her children, so I would assume that means that they had a good relationship. Besides this, not a lot is known about Rasputin's youth. I would anticipate it being generally because he was like a poor person. I shouldn't say like a poor person. He was just not a notable person until he was an adult. So it wasn't like they were like, oh my gosh, this guy's gonna be the bee's knees. We have to record everything about him. No, he was just a peasant child in Siberia. On top of that, he didn't even learn how to read and write until he was a lot older. So he was illiterate for a lot of his youth. He wasn't really remarkable. However, during his childhood, he claimed to experience visions and kind of hear things or like know things before they were supposed to happen. So he would know information about his neighbors, and generally people would get kind of creeped out by him. Now, how he did this, I'm sure not a lot of us know. If he even did this, we probably don't know. We don't even know if that's true. But I would assume he was just eavesdropping and people just didn't notice him because he was a tiny child. Or maybe he was like in his area and then they were chit-chatting on their side of the fence and he was kind of just eavesdropping, just sitting there kind of a thing. But he was a crafty one, I'll give him that. But he did scare the townspeople. During his youth, he also was kind of a criminal. He did crimes from like drinking to not being respectful of authority, because that was a crime back then, to just petty theft. He was a rowdy little boy. So he just acted out a bunch, which is, I mean, if it was cold and I was almost freezing to death all the time, I don't know if I wouldn't act out as well. So in 1886, he traveled into Russia to meet his future wife, where he courted her for a bit. And then when he was 18, they got married. I did try to find how old she was, but the only place that I could find that even listed a date was like, she was born in between 1835 and 1895, which he was born in 1869. So she was either a little bit older than him, or she could have been like, what, 12 when they got married? So it's generally suspicious. But again, I don't think people really cared about her, so they didn't really write down that much. Again, they married when he was 18 in February of 1887. And throughout everything that I'm going to go on in the story, remember that his wife went back to his home in Siberia, and that's where she stayed and raised their kids. Because yes, he is going to leave her at some points during the story. She stayed there and just took care of the kids, did what a wife was supposed to do, which is BS. So throughout this entire thing, she's just at his home in Russia, or not in Russia, in Siberia, just taking care of the kids, just chilling, not hanging around her husband. But for the first 10 years of their marriage, they kind of just got along well. They just chilled at home, did general things. I'm assuming he provided and she took care of the kids. They had a total of 7 kids. They had 3 surviving till adulthood. One was Dmitri, one was Maria, and then one was Varvara, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Maria is really the most important one, and I'm going to talk about her a bit later. In 1897, so a whole 10 years after they had been married, him and his wife, a whole 10 years after they had been married and that, he decided that he was going to leave town. There are several suspected reasons for this. I'm going to move on to concealer real quick. Some say that he had just developed a renewed interest in religion. Some say that he had stolen a horse, and so he wanted to avoid crimes for stealing that horse. And then on top of that, some people say that he had a vision. Some people say that he had a vision of either the Virgin Mary or some other important religious figure, and that's why he decided to go become more religious. Either way, he decided to up and leave his wife and escape town. I'm more leaning to the fact that he was going to be charged with stealing a horse, so he was like, I need to get away from this. I need to skedaddle. Bye, family. But I'm sure the people who believe that he was a wizard and had magic powers are inclined to believe that he had a vision. At 28 years old, he left his wife, who he'd been married to, again, for 10 years they had been married, and went to go become a monk. Now, once he got there, he spent several months there, and that's generally where people believe he learned how to read and write, was at the monastery. He visited St. Nicholas Monastery, by the way. He made some connections with some of the people there, like this name here, because I can't pronounce it once again. He eventually left, saying that the entire thing was too coercive and restricting for him, and he didn't enjoy it. And then he also cited the fact that he believed some monks engaged in homosexuality, and he didn't want to participate in that. That was part of why he said he was going to leave, and that's why, even though he's called the Mad Monk, he was never actually a monk. So now I'm going to dip into some highlighters. I'm going to be using two of my favorites and kind of mixing them together. So after Rasputin decided not to become a monk, he returned home. However, people said that he was vastly different from who he was before he left. He would drink a lot more. He would be a lot more disheveled and unbathed. He was really dirty. But actually, a lot of monks were forbidden to bathe. So he could have picked up this habit when he was trying to become a monk. And he just never kicked it. But honestly, that's disgusting. Especially now. Please bathe. Please. So he didn't bathe. He was generally gross. And then he did some other habit changes. So he decided to become a vegetarian. And he actually was said to have been part of the temperance movement, which is no alcohol during a point in time. But at the same time, other sources said he really enjoyed his alcohol and would get wasted. Wasted. So who knows what's the truth, because we weren't there. He eventually became this wanderer where he would go and preach to a bunch of people. He would just wander. He was said to even go as far as Greece in his wanderings. And when he returned home, he had taken his father's root cellar, because he still lived with his parents, he and his wife, and kind of converted that into his meeting place. He would basically take his followers who were around the village, a lot of which were his family members, but he was charming, so who knows, maybe a bunch of people were there. But he would take his followers, and they would meet there on Sundays in secret. So, for those who weren't involved in the meetings, this became really sus. If you just see a bunch of people going into somebody's root cellar at every Sunday and you're not invited, you might start making up some rumors. Some of the rumors were that he was forcing the female members to kind of just bathe him before. But I don't get that theory, because he was disgusting, as I've mentioned previously. Everyone would be oh my gosh, this guy stinks. He's gross. So clearly that probably wasn't true. So besides saying that he had the female people wash him, another thing that was said, ooh, I'm looking kind of rosy. Another thing that was said was that he was having them sing weird songs, which if he is, so what? Let the man do what he want to do. There's nothing wrong with singing a few songs, my guy. Another thing that was said was that he had run into this creepy cult. And this cult was kind of an offshoot of the Russian Orthodox Church. It was not the Russian Orthodox Church. Please don't get them confused. This is a cult. Here's the name of the cult right here. But this cult was into some kinky shit. And I'm not shaming anyone. If you want that, go ahead. But I think there's something wrong with when you make a religion/cult and then force people to do it. Just my opinion. One of the practices that they believed in was that asphyxiation would help you cleanse your sins. So during their meetings, they would asphyxiate themselves until they got high. Then they would sing some songs and dance around until they felt drunk, and they'd fall on the floor. And then whoever they fell next to on the floor, they'd have sex with them. So this was probably just a rumor, but the townspeople who were freaking out about this weirdo guy who never bathed, who was doing some religious shit in his basement on Sundays, started rumors that he was in this cult to kind of, I suppose, scare people away or justify why they weren't doing anything with him or something along those lines. So I'm going to move on to Bronzer now. But some other things that were rumored was that Rasputin, would bound himself of his own free will to kind of make himself just feel pain on purpose, which, go off, but not really my type of fun Sunday afternoon. That was one of the rumors as well. But anyways, he had a group and they were doing some religious stuff. According to some historians, the cult thing is not true at all, which is kind of obvious. It seems like something nosy townspeople who can't figure somebody out would make up. But sometime between 1902 and 1904, Rasputin would make some very important connections. He claimed to have had a vision that the Romanovs needed his help. So that might have been why he decided to put his plan into motion, or he just wanted to work his way up in the world, and this is just where everything led. He kind of made some connections with these holy people. So one was called This. He's very important to the story later on. And he was introduced to a bunch of these people at this church, and he impressed them and kind of made connections with them. And eventually this helped him in the first step to getting to the Romanovs, which were the royal family, the Tsars of Russia at the time. The Ilador, that person, eventually made it possible for him to go to St. Petersburg, which is where the Romanovs were. So eventually he gets there, and although he eventually charmed them, during the beginning of his time, Rasputin kind of scared the priests. He was able to dilate his eyes at will, so he could turn them almost pitch black, and then again, his stench just kind of off-put them, but he eventually won them over, and they sent him to the Romanovs. Well, not to the Romanovs. They sent him to St. Petersburg, which eventually got him to the Romanovs. By 1905, he had made a smooth path over to St. Petersburg and had connected with several members of the aristocracy there. So 2 of the people he formed friends with were known as the Black Princesses. They're the Black Princesses of Montenegro, and they eventually married into the Romanov royal family. These girls were actually really important to Rasputin in connecting him with the Tsar's family. Not only were they related to them by marriage, they had previously found Alexandra's former spiritual advisor person, Dr. Philip, something like that. They had found him before, and on that man's deathbed, he said that Alexandra would soon meet another royal advisor who would help her, and then she met Rasputin. So right off the bat, it seemed like everything was lining up perfectly for them. However, she did kind of have to keep away from him because she didn't want him to know everything. So they met a few times. It's impossible to know what he did in between these meetings because it wasn't really well documented. Some people say that he went back to his home. Others say that he stayed in St. Petersburg and kind of just wandered around. But overall, he met with them several times. The first time being, I think, in 1905, and then another time in July of 1906, where he sent the Tsar and his wife a telegram letting them know he had a gift for them. He had like a kind of religious statue or something to give them. So he met with them in July, and then in October he met with them again. But in October he also met with their children, who included Anastasia. However, it also includes Alexei, who was the sole son of this kind of royal family, which, as we know, the kings are the important ones, not really the girls, which is stupid. I'm looking at you. Maybe if you had cared about your girls, you guys would have died. Spoiler alert. He met with them and kind of chilled and was like, hey, kids. And now it's really not known when this man found out about Alexei's condition. Some people say it was back in 1905. Some people say that when he met Alexei is when he found out. But he did eventually find out about Alexei's condition, which was hemophilia, I think is what it's called. Yeah, hemophilia, which is basically a condition where it's very hard for your blood to clot. And so if you get any injury or any cut, it's so hard to heal, and you have to take extra time. So if you get a scratch, it's really hard for your blood to clot. You might not even be able to do it, which means that issues might arise. Also around this time, in 1905, so a little bit before this actually, there was some political unrest happening in Russia. So at the time, Finland was under the control of Russia. So I think they had lost a battle to Russia or done something which led Russia to kind of being in charge of them. It had been about 100 years since this had happened. So they had been under the Russia control for about 100 years with no problem. However, when Tsar Nicholas kind of took over, he tried to fuck shit up. In 1899 was the first sign of problems. He had this thing called the February Manifesto, which was the first part of this policy called Russification. Basically, it's saying it's Russia all or nothing. So 1999, the February Manifesto kind of forced Finland into further subjecting themselves to Russia. So it gave the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, more power and made it illegal and a crime to force a Russian Orthodox Church member to go and sit through a Lutheran service. On top of just making that illegal, there was a general strengthening of the church. And besides this, there was also a general censorship of the press, which is very obvious for if you want to kind of control people, you got to censor them. But they also forced the Finnish army to follow Russian rules, like Russian army rules. So they didn't have the same rules in their army originally, but they forced them to follow it because eventually they wanted them to become one army and be able to interchange people. Then, the next year, there was a language manifesto saying that the Russian language was the administrational language of Finland. Now, during this year, in records that were looked at, about 8,000 people in the entirety of Finland were Russian. That's out of 2.7 million people, which means they were taking a minority and trying to put them in power. Obviously, the Finnish aren't going to go for that. Then, after these two things, which were already pissing the Finnish people off, in 1901, there was a conscription law, which incorporated the Finnish army into the Russian army. So they're not only taking people, forcing them to follow Russian rules, but they're just stealing people from Finland and like, we're going to use you now because you're cool. So obviously the Finnish people were not happy about this, which I don't think I would be either. I'd be like, what the fuck are you doing? We followed you fine for like 100 years and now you're just messing everything up. I'm gonna let you in on a secret. Nicholas II of Russia was not really popular, even amongst the Russians. Shh, don't tell anyone. I finished my face, so now I'm going to move on to my eyes. Again, I'm not going to link the brands. I'm not really a makeup artist. I kind of just like makeup. So again, this is really up to you and you can use the products that you enjoy. So I'm going to start by putting down like a base color. From April of 1903 onward, the Finnish people were kind of mad at him. This brings us back to 1905, when Rasputin and Nicholas, the Tsar, first met. During this time, besides the Finnish people being all pissed at Nicholas, the Russian people were starting to get pissed at him. Generally, the Russian government was not being nice to peasants. It was like a class thing. I'm not just calling people peasants, although that's a fun insult. They were just abusing politics and being like, we're rich people, so you have to follow us. Landowners were kind of just like, I'm your landowner, you have to follow me. People of a higher class were just like, hey, I'm in charge of you, follow what I say. And so, of course, people lower on the totem pole were getting upset. Especially during this time. It was a time of modernization for the Russian people. So Russia was trying to mix the old traditions of following certain rules with this modernization, and a new class of people were forming called urban workers. This was kind of tying the cities in with the farmers. So it wasn't like they were separate anymore, and the farmers were just like, oh, we don't see how good they have it. These people were in the cities working, and then they went home and saw how shit their lives were. So obviously they were upset. But I guess that the politicians and stuff didn't really realize it at the time. The workers were being increasingly burdened by taxes because they were trying to support everything and tax them instead of taxing the rich people, which, does that sound familiar? Anyways, they were increasingly burdened by taxes. They were very angry with their situation and they weren't really getting any governmental help. And there wasn't even really a way to talk to the government. It wasn't like Nicholas II was just out in the streets making speeches or there was the internet. No, this was a time before then when he was kind of isolated and just doing what he wanted to do. And he wasn't very popular with the people, as I mentioned. Furthermore, the people who were elected to the local governments in these places weren't being listened to. They were kind of just figureheads and their powers were being restricted. And then Russia had just lost a war with Japan. So the Russian people's prides, especially in the peasant class, were not up to par with those of the royals. They didn't really see a reason for their government to be like this. All of this combined kicked off a revolution of sorts. This started with Bloody Sunday on January 9th, or around then, of 1905. I believe Rasputin met Nicholas in November, so 9 months before they met, this is when this kicked off. Bloody Sunday is when police officers and soldiers fired on unarmed workers and civilians who were protesting and just marching. So they were doing a peaceful protest and they were shot, which obviously would piss some people off. It would piss me off if that happened. So people argue that that's really the start of the revolution. However, some historians also argue that it started in February of 1905. Now, in February of 1905, probably due to the Bloody Sunday shit that happened in January, the Tsar, their little father, kind of gave this decree that was like, hey guys, you guys can come say your grievances to me. And that obviously pissed people off because it seemed like he was making a joke out of everything. Then in October, a month before the Tsar met Rasputin, at a party, there was another thing where the Tsar decreed that he was going to agree to an elected legislation, which was called the State Duma. So this garnered a general strike, and then in December, a month after he met Rasputin, there was an armed uprising. These conflicts would eventually lead to the dissolution of the Second Duma and then rewriting of some of the legislation in favor of ethnic Russian landowners. But this didn't happen until 1907. So the Romanovs were kind of dealing with this whole political conflict, which everything kind of settled down a little bit in 1907. But they were dealing with this and in the midst of it when they met Rasputin. I'm going to be taking this kind of pinky color. It turns out to be a lot more tan on the eyes. I'm putting that kind of in my crease. So I can't imagine being a mother having your child have this illness that could make it really hard for them if they got hurt. Like, he apparently wasn't even allowed to play with his sisters because they might hurt him. So I could see how dealing with that, you would want some comfort, or you'd want something that helps fix this, especially when her husband was going through all of these uprisings. And Alexei was their only son, so it's very much that he's going to take the throne. So she was concerned for him, as any mother would be. Rasputin's influence on the royal family stemmed from the fact that Alexandra believed that he was a healer. Again, as I mentioned, it's not really established when Rasputin discovered Alexei's problems, but eventually he did, and in 1906 in October, allegedly he was summoned to kind of pray for Alexei with Alexandra. So she was very aware that he knew of the issue with Alexei. After he had been summoned by her to pray with him, he kind of cemented himself as very integral to the family. Now, he had been rumored of faith healing for a while, but this was her first encounter with it. And one of her friends, her name's Anna, and then her last name starts with a V. I'll leave that up here somewhere for you to look at. Her friend was one of his biggest supporters. So, of course, she would believe in him. Then, about 5 years later, was really when things would kick off. Alexei, I'm sorry if you just heard that noise, that's my foot rubbing on my desk. In the summer of 1912, Alexei was playing around. He developed a hemorrhage in his thigh and groin after a carriage ride jolted him all around. He was having a really hard time with it. His blood wasn't clotting because of his condition, and then on top of that, all of what the doctors were doing wasn't working. He was still bleeding and he was still suffering. He was very close to death. In desperation, his mom calls Rasputin and is like, hey bro, what the fuck? Help. And so he really couldn't get there, but he told her not to let the doctors do anything, reject their help. Some sources even say that he told her to throw anything they were giving him in the fire. Don't take this advice, people. In this case, it worked, but vaccines help you, okay? Especially during these times. Listen to people. Stay home. Do your social distancing. Do your quarantine. If we live, then everything will be great. Calm down. Everything's fine. Everything's fine as long as we live. Anyways, back to distracting myself from the outside situation going on in the world right now. It turns out that Rasputin's advice worked. Alexei got better after they stopped having the doctors help him. So there are many theories behind this. Some believe that it was Alexei was having issues because his mom was freaking out. So some believe that Rasputin saying like, oh, your child's gonna live, just reject the doctor's help, calmed her down and by default then calmed Alexei down. And so him being calm and his mom being so assured kind of helped his recovery and kind of mind over mattered it. Other people, however, think it's because the doctors were giving him aspirin, which at the time kind of reduced fevers and would help all his symptoms. However, they didn't know that aspirin was a blood thinner. So for blood that already can't clot, this was a fatal mistake and could have killed him. It could be that that was what was helping him, or In other cases, not necessarily this case, it was rumored that Rasputin was hypnotizing Alexei, which I don't know how that would help him, but like, go off. So next I'm going to kind of take like a more brown color and put that in the outer V. After this, Alexandra really trusted him. So Rasputin really started to be a central figure in their household. He provided the Tsar with some drugs like cocaine and opium and that stuff in order to help calm his nerves and some other like stress conditions that he had developed. However, this gave the Tsar an addiction to seeing Rasputin because every time Rasputin would come, he would bring the drugs that he was now addicted to. On top of that, Alexandra joined the company and really thought that he was helping her son. So of course they're going to see him a lot. Eventually, he was invited to the house like once a week. He came over so often, in fact, that he started referring to the royal family and the Tsar and his wife as Mama and Papa, which is creepy, to say the least. I'm sorry. If a grown man ever calls me Mama, I'm about to smack him. Don't do that. That's creepy, man. I'm taking a fresh blending brush and kind of blending that out. Rasputin really was gaining the trust of the royal family. He would pray with the kids at about bedtime. He would read them stories. And overall, he was becoming the children's friend who knows what was happening. Especially because all those poor children are not around. Who knows what was happening there? So one day, Rasputin was accused of rape by the maid in the royal family's palace, home, same difference. You'd think that the royal family would wake up and kind of be like, oh my gosh, we let this man around our kids. No, they fired the maid because he was in their favor and they wouldn't believe that he would do that. So they fired the maid. Then the children's nanny tried to kick Rasputin out of the nursery one time so she could put the kids to bed, and the kids got mad at the nanny and was just like, hey, Rasputin's our friend. So they basically tattletaled on the nanny, said she tried to kick him out and she's mean to us, and so the nanny got fired. So this is really showing that Rasputin is untouchable at this point. But these incidents also could have been the start of sexual rumors surrounding Rasputin. Rasputin was developing kind of a reputation amongst people in Russia. He had a fan club of women who would host potluck parties with him and just bake him food and bring it to his house. Okay, so now I'm going to be taking a shimmer shade. I'm going to be taking that and putting that in the center of my eyes. Even though his table manners were disgusting, even though he was not bathing, even though he was generally gross, these women were fawning all over him. They loved him. They were just like, oh my gosh, my Lord and Savior. One of them even left her husband for him. Can you imagine being that lady's husband? You think you're having a great marriage and then all of a sudden she ups and leaves you for this weird Siberian monk who never bathes and eats weird? He was quite the hit amongst the ladies. This woman eventually... There's an account of these people showing up, opening a door, and then it's this woman named Olga. She's holding Rasputin's penis, saying, you are God, I am yours. And so these people just kind of closed the door and backed out of there and kind of just ran away. But there's accounts of that, and that's creepy. Also, remember what I mentioned. His wife is, like, taking care of his children in Siberia, which is cold and gross. Overall, not winning any Husband of the Year awards, this guy. So I'm going to be taking like a flatter brush and kind of doing my under eye now. Then there's another rumor about this man that he would go to bathhouses and you'd think he would bathe, but I already told you he was dirty, so no, he wasn't bathing. He would take sex workers with him into these houses, get naked, take off his belt, and then start beating the sin out of them. So he'd just start whipping them with a belt until they were bleeding. And then he would have sex with them. This man is disgusting. The fact that he wanted to call himself, I'm not religious, but the fact that he wanted to say that he was doing this in the name of God really pisses me off. So Rasputin was not the best of dudes, as you could see. But the press kind of took all of this and ran with it. Because of the previous revolt that had restricted their powers, and there was the revolution and all that, remember what I mentioned? Their powers had kind of been given back to them, plus some. So they had renewed powers, and they could talk about what they wanted to. So they started making up rumors about Rasputin. The biggest of which has lasted until this day, is that he was sleeping with the Tsarina. Now, historians say that there's no proof for this, and she was probably very loyal to her husband, but It was a rumor that was going around at the time, and it kind of affected his reputation. Another rumor was that he was betraying Russia in favor of Germany by providing people with poisoned apples from Canada. I'm sorry, what? Like, these people must have been really bored without the internet. I swear. So I'm going to take that and kind of do a tiny little bit of eyeliner on the top with some black eyeshadow. His former priest friends heard about this, and obviously they were upset. Because here's this man that they thought possessed, like, holy healing powers, who's abusing those powers in their minds, which he didn't really have powers, but he was abusing people. And they had had enough of it. So his former friends came out there, called him up, were like, hey bro, let's hang out. And then they went after him. They beat him with a wooden crucifix, like a big wooden crucifix. They started beating him until he was bleeding. But Rasputin gets away with everything. He tattled on them and was just like, they tried to kill me, mommy, they tried to kill me, to the Tsarina of Russia, so she had them exiled. Iliador? Question mark? He eventually ended up fleeing to Finland, dressed as a woman, so nobody knew where he was going. Which, I don't know if the Finnish kind of appreciated that with their relationship with Russia, but Iliador was actually trying to kill this bitch. He was pissed off. He did not like him at all. He thought he was a disgrace. Yada, 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 right? One of his followers decided to take it upon herself and kill the Antichrist. Ooh. This was the first assassination attempt of Rasputin. Iliador's follower, this girl was a peasant. She followed Iliador and followed his branch of religion, listened to him preach, that stuff. So when he hated Rasputin, she did too. In June of 1914, she found Rasputin's home, and she knew that he was visiting there. So she went to his house and waited for him to come outside, which eventually he had to, right? So he had received a telegram and was going to respond to it when he saw her outside. She came up to him and stabbed him in the abdomen, saying, I have killed the Antichrist. Some reports say that she even reached in his stomach and tried to pull his intestines out, which is A, gross, but B, damn, this girl committed. She was out there to kill that man. She wanted to make her father happy. Her father, like religious father, not her dad. He was not her dad. But she was out there to make shit happen. I mean, she tried it. He didn't die. He ran away from her, and she ran after him, trying to stab him more. So eventually Rasputin met up with the general townspeople who saw what was happening and were kind of just like, oh shit, we might need to help our man out. They stopped her and tried to kill her, but eventually police arrived and took her away. You'd think she'd get prosecuted for trying to kill the friend of the queen, but no, she was deemed insane. Now, according to her, she had never had syphilis, but she was damaged by some medication since she was 13. Other reports say that she had syphilis, but I'm inclined to believe that maybe she was damaged by medications because that's what she said, but I don't know if I can trust a murderer or an attempted murderer. So, believe what you will. It is up to you. Believe at your own discretion. However, on this same day, Franz Ferdinand was murdered, kind of kickstarting World War I. So this is a big day in Europe, and the rest of the world too. Rasputin, who was recovering in the hospital, could not go to the Tsar and kind of give him advice, which was kind of to the Tsar's detriment. Rasputin was very much against the war. He believed that it would end in a bloody mess, and that it was not good for Russia. But the Tsar didn't listen. The Russian people were ready to kind of just get out, and commit. They were like, we're gonna fight for this country, we're gonna make up for how we lost in Japan, let's do this shit. But that didn't really work out in their favor. Because eventually, at the end of the war, so many people died from Russia's side. I mean, so many people died in general. Anyways, Rasputin was really against going into this war. So after he eventually recovered, he noticed that the food transportation systems and how they would feed the poor were broken, and that they could start a political uprising. So he wrote to the Tsar, kind of just like, hey buddy, can you fix this? I'm trying to help you out. And the Tsar ignored him. So he had a telegram sent to Alexander kind of being like, hey, you might want to pass out food in the street, kind of help people. And although she seemed open to the idea, she never really did anything about it. I'm going to hurt myself. Oh my goodness gracious. I did this beautiful eye and then I blink and mess everything up. Oh my god, I'm making it worse. The Tsarina didn't really do anything, so Rasputin decided he was going to reach out to the other political people around. However, they didn't really do anything either. They were kind of just like, yeah, they're peasants. What do we get? What do we care? Because of the lack of response, this would eventually come back to bite them in the butt. But for now, let's move on with the story. So eventually, Rasputin would join Alexandra at the palace once he recovered. Why did I had such a beautiful eye look and I've just fucked everything up. Oh my goodness. Now when he joined her, he was given a little bit of power, but not enough to solve any issues. He kind of just appointed some political people that he felt would do a good job, but he was not very well versed in politics. Although he could see what was happening to people, politics wasn't really his gig, you know? So he kind of didn't really appoint the best people when he was allowed to. So I'm going to kind of redo this eye since I messed it up so badly. Rasputin tried to get to do what he wanted to do. He was feeling himself, but then he realized he was probably going to die soon. And he could no longer heal people. Not that he was probably ever really able to heal people. But he realized this, so he wrote to Alexandra. In this sense, Rasputin kind of predicted his own demise. He wrote to Alexandra, if one of your relations brings upon my death, then none of your family will remain alive for more than 2 years. They will all be killed by the Russian people. Tell your relatives that I had paid for them with my blood. I shall be killed. I am no longer amongst the living. Pray and be strong. But honestly, like, this bitch really thought he was Jesus. He's like, I'm gonna sacrifice myself. I'm gonna pay for everybody's sins. But it's like, bitch, you ain't Jesus. So anyways, the kind of ego-tripping, hallucinating ass Rasputin was accurate in a way that I'll get into in a little bit. Many politicians were starting to dislike Rasputin. They wanted this Siberian peasant to get the fuck out of the palace. Stop taking their role. Stop being influential. We want to do what we want to do, and you're in our way. GTFO, my guy. They eventually felt that Rasputin was part of the reason that their government was on the verge of collapse. They thought that this punk man who's from Siberia had no right to influence the queen. They thought, wow, this man has too much power for a Siberian peasant. And they wanted him out. A rich person being mad at a poor person for having power? I've never heard about that in my life. One of these people was the Tsarina's nephew, Felix. Now, Felix did that. He saw the influence that Rasputin had on his aunt, who was his aunt by marriage. They weren't related by blood, but he was still married to her blood. He saw the influence that Rasputin had on his aunt, and he wanted it to stop. He invited Rasputin over to his house. Some people say for a dinner party, but I'm not into semantics. He invites Rasputin over to his house. He and the Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich, and some other nobles are at the house waiting for Rasputin. They get Rasputin over there, and once Rasputin gets there, they all head down to the basement because basements are always safe. You always trust your friends. Hey, let's go hang out in the basement, guys. So they all head down to the basement, and they're just chilling. And eventually, Felix is like, hey, we have some of these foods. Would you like some? Now, records of this are a little hazy, but it's reported that although Rasputin originally refused, he eventually accepted. Now, the issue with his acceptance was these foods were kind of laced with cyanide, or they were believed to have been laced with cyanide. Rasputin didn't know this. He's chowing down on these cakes, and nothing's happening. So obviously, Felix is a little bit upset. He's just like, what? I thought there was cyanide in here, and this bitch is still alive. What the fuck? Then Rasputin asks him for some wine. There was also supposedly cyanide in the wine. So Felix had no problem with this. Felix hands him the wine and he sees him getting a little bit drunk, but nothing else is happening. So obviously Felix is like, what the shit, man? This guy is the actual devil. Felix, kind of panicked, excuses himself, goes upstairs, gets a gun, comes back downstairs, tells Rasputin, and I quote, better look at the crucifix and say a prayer. and then shoots him in the chest. Rasputin collapses to the floor. They take his clothes and his hat, and one of the co-conspirators gets into a car and pretends to be him and goes to like where he was staying to kind of act like Rasputin made it home. These sneaky bitches. Then, after they come back, Dmitri and Felix head downstairs to kind of get Rasputin's body and deal with it, but Rasputin wasn't dead. Rasputin was alive, and he jumps at these bitches and is like, fuck you, right? After kind of stunning these guys, Rasputin escapes the basement and heads outside to try and get the fuck out of there. Because obviously these bitches trying to kill him. Like, he trying to escape, my guy. But it doesn't really work. The men catch up to him and shoot him 3 times. 1 in the head. Didn't turn out very well for Rasputin. He collapses to the snow, is kind of bleeding out. They take him to a river and dump him in it. There are some claims that one of them beat Rasputin with a dumbbell while he was collapsed on the ground. There's other things that say they slammed his body into a trunk. But anyways, he ended up in a river. Even though the murderers tried to be not suspicious, they ended up giving themselves away. One of the men, his name will be right here, was a complete dumbass. He spoke openly about Rasputin's murder to 2 soldiers and a policeman. And then he was like, oh, I didn't know that would happen. When the next day they opened an investigation into his murder. Yeah, no shit. If you're gonna murder someone and try to cover it up, at least put some effort into it, my guy. Anyways, clearly, although they said they were trying hard to cover it up, they didn't do a very good job of it. Rasputin was eventually discovered by like some fishermen due to like the bloodiness of the scene, because again, dumbasses. Some people say that his hands were pressing up against the ice, like he was still alive and trying to get out of there. However, this is just a rumor, because the official coroner for the case eventually said he died from the gunshot wound to his head and was not alive when he entered the water. Although they lost his initial report, so he was just going off of what he remembered. Then, some people also said that there were water in his lungs, so he definitely died by drowning. But again, the coroner disputed this and was like, nah, bitch, he died from the gunshot wound to his head. Also, shout out to Stephanie Sue. Hey, girl, I love your videos. Like she would ever be seeing this. Anyways, his death is just as mysterious as he was in life. So after his death, he had like a funeral procession, and although his family wasn't invited, they ended up attending the friend of the Queen's afterwards, who was his big supporter. And then once they found out that Felix was involved, Alexandra, she exiled him. And then later on, even though he was buried, Rasputin's body was dug up and then burned. Now, this was done for one of 2 reasons. The first reason is that they wanted to ensure that he never came back to life. Ooh, so mysterious. But the other one actually makes more sense. The other one is that they didn't want his body to kind of become a place for those who were still in support of the old regime, aka the Romanovs, to go and meet or to be a symbol of their resistance against the new form of government that would take over. So they burned his body later on. There's also a rumor that even though they burned his body, they chopped his penis off first, because it was a magical penis, of course, and it charmed all these women. So the rumor is that it's on display in a Russian museum in St. Petersburg. But other people say that this is just a myth and that it's not really there. But if it's on display in a museum, I'm sorry, what is up with you, Russia? Now, there was another conspiracy theory about his death. The conspiracy theory was, since Felix had attended university in Oxford, that he met up with some of his buddies there who were spies come to mess with Russia, and that his buddies helped set up and maybe even executed the assassination of Rasputin. However, a lot of historians don't believe that this was actually accurate and don't give it much credence. So, whatever you want to think, but it's a fun little conspiracy theory. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about what happened after his death. The Romanovs eventually ended up dying, in part due to protests started by food shortages. Now, if you remember, I talked about it earlier. Rasputin noticed that there was something wrong with how food was distributed among the masses. He kind of knew what was going to happen because he paid attention. And since the Tsar didn't listen to him, it kind of brought his own downfall. Also, people say that Rasputin prophesied his own death, which is true. He did do that. So, yay. Eventually, people rioted in the streets because the Tsar was getting fresh baked goods and they weren't. They were getting rations during the war, so they were very upset about it. which of course I would be too. When you treat people unfairly, they're bound to get upset and something's bound to happen. Overall, there were some protests in February of 1917. Overall, 1,300 people were killed. Some of the soldiers eventually went and joined the People's Party, and eventually the Romanovs were overthrown and killed. If you guys ever want me to make a video about the Romanovs specifically, just leave it in the comments below, and maybe I'll make one day. The next person I want to talk about is his daughter Maria. Now, his daughter fled Russia after the revolution, and she became a lion tamer in a circus in the United States. Her kind of tagline was the daughter of the Mad Monk of Russia, which I thought is interesting because I guess she was really proud of her dad. She also wrote some books about her dad, arguing points that Felix had written in his own book about situations, saying that her dad didn't like sweets and he wasn't actually an alcoholic. But overall, none of us can prove this because the man we're talking about isn't alive. And it's he said, she said at this point. But she did paint a good picture of her father, and she loves her father. Now, this was another fun fact that I wanted to talk about. This is kind of related to Rasputin, but more about Felix. So there was a movie made about Rasputin and his death. The movie is called Rasputin and the Empress, and it was released in 1932 by MGM. So the movie kind of follows Rasputin and his rise to power, and then it also talks about his relationship with the Tsarina. Somebody in the movie, the prince, is depicted as Rasputin's murderer. Now, they don't say his name, but it's clearly Felix. But he himself had admitted to killing Rasputin, so he couldn't really sue them, even though their depiction of him wasn't great. However, there was also a scene in the movie which Rasputin does some not so fun stuff to his wife, which never actually happened in reality. Irina, Felix's wife, was highly upset at the portrayal of her being raped by Rasputin, as anyone would be. She said that it damaged her reputation and portrayed her in a bad light, and she ended up suing them. And so she ended up winning, and she got $127,000, which doesn't seem a lot, but in today's money is around $2.4 million. These companies and these filmmaking people were not happy about this. They eventually came up with a solution. Their solution was to come up with this disclaimer that they would put before anything, just in case the portrayals were not to people's liking, so that they wouldn't get sued. And here's what it says. This is a work of fiction. Any similarities to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Although we kind of think of it as a stupid thing now, especially in stories that are based on true stories, kind of protects the companies from getting sued. So I thought this was a fun way to end it, and kind of how Rasputin eventually affected even Hollywood and filmmaking in general. So this was the story of Rasputin. Now let's put on some lipstick and let's talk about it. Whether you liked him or you didn't like him, Rasputin was an important figure to the evolution of Russia. He was the peasant voice for a while there. Part of the reason the peasants got mad when he died is because they felt like the nobility were silencing them, rightfully so, because one of the reasons for killing him was the fact that he was a peasant, and they didn't like the influence that he had over the queen. But he also did some horrific stuff, like potentially raping people and just being a not so good guy. Overall, he's a very interesting figure, and I'm glad that I got to talk about him. If you have any suggestions for any future videos, please leave them in the comments below. I'd say that I finished my makeup, even though I kind of messed up a little bit along the way. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please hit that like button, and if you want to see more, please hit that subscribe button. And I hope you guys have a great day. Now with some setting spray, I'm gonna say goodbye. Bye everyone!